who led people to the promised land. He landed with 600 ex-slaves in Kingfisher, Oklahoma Territory. The year before, lands to the west were opened. To feed his people, he preached at the Rock Island Station. He did that for years.
The old gentleman would come down here and meet the trains. There would probably in those days be 3 or 4 trains a day. He had his cane and he was stooped a little bit. And he would start to sing. The old ox are moving, moving, moving. The old ox are moving right along. They're going up to heaven like a feather in the air. The old ox are moving, moving. The old ox are moving right along. That was it. That was part of his preaching in a way of speaking. After the train had stopped, people then, of course, would throw a little money out to him. Sometimes maybe they'd throw $1, 50 cents, sometimes a silver dollar in those days, but mostly it was probably nickels and dimes.
And I'd say he would feed 200 or 300 people about 3 times a month. And all this food would derive from salesmen that was coming through here, and they would give him sometimes hogs, turkeys, Indians, and whites, and blacks, and all of them would come to this feast. He's a preacher, but he lived it.
Now the scene shifts. The boys all left here and enlisted in the old Oklahoma National Guard. We finally got overseas. We went into the lines. We lost a lot of good boys. I got knocked out pretty bad. Now I'm on the platform in Paris, France, and I'm waiting for the train to go to Le Havre, to cross the channel, to go home on a visit. The Frenchman asked me what part of Oklahoma was I from, and I said Kingfisher. And he studied a second, and his brows knitted. Ah, he says, the black man, he dance, he sing. And I looked at him in amazement, you know. And I said, yes. Old ox are moving. Old ox are moving right along. Like going up to heaven, like a feather in the air. The old ox are moving. Old ox are moving right along. Now he had lots more verses to that, but I don't recall them. He had other songs he sang too, but I don't remember any of those. But I do remember that real well.
When gay bells trump, you shall hear, and we'll all shout together in that morning.
The public pressure to open up new lands did not stop with the western runs. There were those who felt the civilized tribes held more land than they needed, and that eastern Oklahoma ought to be open to white settlement. Up to this point, the land in Indian Territory belonged to the tribes as a whole. There was no individual ownership. But the government set up the Dawes Commission in the late 1800s in hopes that after land was assigned individually, white settlers could find room. They did.
And all they angels bid them come, and we'll all shout together in that morning.
In order to allot the land, the Dawes Commission was instructed to prepare a list of members of each tribe. This list included black freedmen. Not all of the blacks were to get an even shake. But Creek freedmen got more than anybody else due to the twinkling eye of Judge Reed.
Judge Reed was an honorable man, but he was a black man, and he was for his people. But he was an interpreter. He was educated. He interpreted for all of the chiefs. And so when they got to the allotment of the land, and the chiefs, they were sitting with the Dawes Commission, said, well, now, how much of this land? Now, we've got it there, we can give 160 acres. The chief said, Indians ought to get 160 acres. At least that's what Judge Reed interpreted to them. Indians ought to get 160 acres. And then they said, well, ask him what is he going to do about these black people, these freedmen, these slaves. What do they get? Say, don't they get something? And the chief said, nothing. Give them nothing. And then the Dawes Commission, they asked Judge Reed, said, now, what did he say? He said, same thing. They depended on his interpretation.
I remember back when this was all black and Indian in this section of the country. So I remember the first white man I ever saw. His name was Ed Hart. He gave me a dime and gave George Drew a nickel. Well, I looked at the size of money and I said, now here, I'm getting the short end of this thing. So I just traded with George, you know. Trade my dime for his nickel. I didn't know any better until we sent for some candy. Well, see, I didn't get but 5 or 6 sticks. And George got 10. They were a penny apiece, you see. And so that's the first time I got stuffed. First deal I made, I got stuffed.
And that was the first white man you
First white man, his name was Ed Hart.
Foreman for Seaver's
foreman
Ranch.
on Seaver's Ranch.
That's right, I know him.
Absolutely.
Oklahoma was one of the few places where blacks actually owned land. And from the beginning, this fact was not lost to blacks or whites. It was a seat of power, but a bone of contention. For years, a move had been underfoot to make Oklahoma an all-black state. In 1890, it was spurred on by Edwin McCabe, a black man who sought appointment as territorial governor. McCabe had been state auditor of Kansas, but when his party refused to let him run for a second term, he came to Oklahoma, convinced that power lay only in numbers. For 10 years, McCabe's paper, the Langston Herald, was distributed throughout the South, urging settlement in Oklahoma's all-black towns.
There's between 15 and 20 Negro towns in a 50-mile radius of Muskogee. Now, when you stop to say, well, who are some of them? I could start with Taft, and then I could go down to Rentisville, could come up here to Summit, could go over here, down here to Wybark, and I'm talking about these are post offices. Go from Wybark over to Tallahassee. There was a little town, Redbird, and Clarksville. All of those were absolute Negro towns. But now, why did these towns come into existence? Well, one thing about it is people liked to get where they could have something of their own. One thing about it is they had a Negro mayor, had a Negro city council, and everything, all the offices. They come here to Muskogee, they couldn't hold one of those offices. They couldn't even get to be a dog catcher. Well, I mean, that's something fabulous. These other folks, they'd hear about that, and the folks would leave here and go down there and sell them lots. And some of them would come up to see. Yeah, they'd come up to see. There was a Negro postmaster. They'd take him on down there and introduce him. Yeah. There was a Negro mayor. Yeah. They'd stay there and call a meeting. There's a Negro councilman. Yeah. There's a Negro marshal, town marshal. Yeah. And they were frightened and afraid, and they were being mishandled by the Ku Klux Klan and all other kind of other things. So it was really the first cry of freedom.
But black homesteaders were greatly outnumbered. McCabe finally did manage to become deputy territorial auditor, but the only elected territorial black official lasted one term. G.I. Curran, a representative from Kingfisher, authored the territory's first civil rights bill. It did not pass. The seed of power had been planted in sand. Three laws did pass the legislature, and they were to affect the course of Oklahoma education to this day. The first allowed settlers to decide every 3 years whether they wanted to put black children in separate schools, a practice that had not been widespread before statehood. The second took that option away, and the third law forbid teachers from teaching children of the opposite race. Of course, many districts did not have enough black students to justify the cost of a separate school. So arrangements were made to bus black students to adjoining districts. They called it buckboarding.
It's interesting to get the history of how Langston University came about. My father and two other men, neighbors there, and old man Bradley, they took Mamie Bradley and put her in a spring wagon. I don't know whether y'all know what a spring wagon is or not. You call them pickups now with an automobile. Demanded to enroll this girl in the school at Edmond. Well, oh Lord, you see, they had come in prior to statehood and all, but now Oklahoma came in segregated. Well, when they went out and took Mamie Bradley over there and demanded it, that was when the legislature got together and decided that they said we got to set up a school for these black folks. We got to set up a school for the Negroes, of course, call them all Negroes then. And then there was this little prosperous community of educated people named after Langston, named after Negro congressman. That's where the name Langston came back. So they decided, and here's what the legislature did. I think the legislature put up $5,000. If the town of Langston, if the people out there would give 40 acres, and they gave barbecues, pie suppers. Well, where the Langston sits there now is that original 40 acres.
But still, segregation was not widespread before statehood. People needed each other. Pigment made no difference in the dust at baling time.
The farmers helped each other, and you prepared dinner, they all ate together, and in fact, you really didn't know your color unless you went to a mirror, see. And now perhaps I did live in an exceptional community, but I came from a time when people were hauling wheat to town on wagons, and if you were going to see a neighbor, you could go down to your box and wait until the wagon came by and ride on with that farm, and then in the evening when the wagon would come, you hear it squeaking coming back, you could go down and catch a ride coming home. That'd be for the black child and the white child.
And we played together. Ron would go over there and stay all night with his white girl, come over and stay all night with us. We didn't think no more about it. And then visit back and forth as though we were all one nationality. And we never did have a crossword. As the other wasn't busy and other than fixing the fence, he'd come over and help him. And when his fence needed fixing, Dad would go over there and help him. And they were more lovable, that's one thing. They're so narrow now. And they're so afraid you'll have more than they got. And I told them the one thing I want is heaven when I die. And live comfortable while I'm here.
the fall of 1906, my husband and I would go down to the courthouse and go in the judge's chamber and listen to political speeches. C.N. Haskell was running for the Democratic nomination for governor. Anytime he was there, his name was mentioned, he would have quite a crowd. They were in the courtroom, but I was in the chamber. And in one of his campaign speeches, he made the assertion that they were not to mention anything about the Negro or Jim Crow or anything until after the Constitution was signed by the president, who was then Theodore Roosevelt. Because if they did, Theodore Roosevelt would certainly not sign it, and they couldn't become a state. They would wait until after the first assembly of the legislature to pass any kind of law. Then they could do as they pleased about it. And all that pleased them. And they gave vent to their feelings by throwing up their hats and just hollering and hooping, and they didn't mention anything about it at all. It was only after the first House and Senate they did the dirty work, so to speak, because they passed the Jim Crow law and passed separate coaches for Negroes and whites, and they were just absolutely, it made you feel that you just weren't human, that's all.
After the Constitutional Convention, segregation became a highly charged political issue. Black citizens were, for the most part, Republicans, and Democrats, wanting to ensure a majority, did everything possible to see that blacks did not get their rights.
You couldn't vote unless your grandfather voted in 1866, I believe. And 66, of course, that prohibited all Negroes from voting because no Negroes, their grandparents didn't vote in 66.
Dan Porter was an old Civil War veteran. At that time, they were enforcing the Jim Crow law. The man said to him, says, "Don't you go in there and try to vote." He said, "You can't read." He says, "That don't make no difference." Says, "I'm one of the men that made General Lee surrender." You know who General Lee was, did you? He was general in the Civil War. Yeah, well, he was an old soldier. Well, he voted.
But a black man did get elected to the first house. A.C. Hamlin scooted to office after a staggering campaign expenditure of $5.45. He told the Secretary of State it would have been less. But a lot of his constituents enjoyed parties. There was nowhere to turn. segregation had received the blessing of the U.S. Supreme Court. And in all things social, blacks were to be as separate as the fingers on the hand. The court called it separate but equal, but nobody really believed that.
The Senate met. The first Senate bill, of course, was separate coaches. There shall be separate coaches for Negroes and whites. And the separate coaches, the Negroes will put in just a little place right in front of the train and right next to the baggage car. And it was not very comfortable, wasn't kept clean, and it was just very undesirable. And it stayed that way as long as they had separate coaches.
Yeah. Oh, I don't know why. I rode on the train a many a time. A man by the name of Richard Taylor and I would go backward and forward from here to Dover. We walked in and sat down in the coach in the Jim Crow. Taylor sat down with me. So when the conductor come through taking tickets, he said, Taylor says, "What are you doing in here?" Well, he said, Taylor says, "I'm sitting down." Well, he said, "Don't you know you're in the wrong coach?" He says, "Well, I don't know whether I am or not." So he says, "Now you get up and go in the next coach." Well, the next apartment, because they only had it was a smoking part that was for the colored. And on the other side was where the whites smoked it. So Taylor says, "Well, maybe I don't belong in there." He says, "Well, what are you?" Well, he says, "I'm a man like anybody else."
When shall I be delivered from this vain world of sin? Shall yell the trumpet sound in that morning? Shout of glory, for I shall mount above the sky. Yeah, the trumpet sound in that morning. Well, that's it. Yes, sir, that's it. My eyes about gone now. Yeah, they're old. They're too old. They're about gone on me.